Welcome to the 32nd in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. And today we're going to begin our next session, Moroccans with Artillery, Sa'adians to Alaouites. For those who are familiar, permit me to explain the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, politics, or any of the subjects that we're going to be discussing today. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm just a layperson who enjoys this and is trying to give this from a secular perspective, right? We're going to touch upon some religious topics. In each case, I'm trying to address it from that secular historical perspective. Let's be respectful of the of the subject matter. But that said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications are always welcome. Please put them in the chat. I do read the chat and I will respond in time. As I always say, classes are a 101 and a 201, meaning if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already knew something, I'll probably teach you something you didn't know. When I give dates for people, those are the years of service. That's not their birth and death, although it can be their death in certain cases. I like to do what's called a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if we get to that 2-hour mark and I've already, and there's still more slides, which is probably going to happen tonight, that's okay. That's where we'll stop, and we'll let some of that roll over into next week. And finally, this is a recording like the other 31 episodes, and you can watch it later accordingly. So, some basic review. We'd seen that Morocco only fell to the Umayyad Caliphate during the third invasion of the Maghreb, led by Musa ibn Nusayr, because they had fought against armed resistance throughout the north, the Maghreb region, that northwest region of Africa. In particular, they had fought against Cassilis and Kahina, Berber chieftains, in what is today Algeria. But eventually we see the Moroccans become part of the Islamic world. And we should sort of do a quick note on the different ethnicities in Morocco. There are 3 dominant Berber ethnicities. You have the Zenata in the north, the Masmouda in the mountains, which run along the backbone of Morocco, and you have the Songhai, which live in the desert to the south. We've seen Moroccan dynasties from all 3 of these different Amazigh or Berber ethnicities. For example, we've seen the Almohads from the Masmouda. We've seen the Almoravids from the Songhai, and we've seen the Idrisids from the Zenata. Now, we have a 4th group, and those are the Sharifians. The Sharifians claim to be true Arabs, meaning that their heritage comes from Arabia, and that they moved to Morocco with the early colonization of Morocco by Arabs during the Arab conquests. So one of the things worth discussing, and it's something that we hadn't really highlighted, was the gold trade that occurred between Morocco and the African states. In particular, you had the state of Ouagadougou. Ouagadougou is commonly called the state of Ghana, but Ghana is incorrect. Ghana is the name of their leader. Similarly to the title of king or sultan, the leader of Ouagadougou was called Ghana or Ghana. And you can see the Ghana Tunkamenin, who is probably the most powerful of the Ghana in Ouagadougou, ruling over the people from his capital in Kumbisale. Ghana, by and large, was made of Soninke peoples who still live in what's today the country of Mali. And they were very lucky in that their region, the exact borders we don't know, because by and large the people of Ouagadougou were illiterate. So the only things we know about them are the things that Arabs decided to tell us about them. But those areas became incredibly wealthy through the gold trade. And you can see the gold indicated on this map by areas of orange. Those are where those gold deposits are, and they would be collected from the river. So those gold deposits would be small little pearls that you would get from moving, straining through the water and then retrieving that gold. And the trade that developed during the time of Ghana, during the time of Ghana Tunka was a salt for gold trade, where these things were traded pound for pound, and the salt would come from Tagaza or Tawadeni. You can see those on the map of Western Africa on the right hand side, and you can see the camels pulling salt blocks. For those who are unfamiliar, because of the way that chemically salt exists, it can be cut literally into squares, and that's how you carry it. So those are actually blocks of salt that are carved out of the mine and brought down to Ouagadougou for trading. And those trade routes included ones that go to Morocco. If you look at the northwestern side of the map, you can see trade routes that go from Adarost, just north of the area of Ouagadougou, to Sidi Muhammad, which was Morocco's door to the south, and then from Sidi Muhammad to the other major cities of Morocco, like Marrakesh or like Fez. Now, during this period, Moroccans come south as diplomats, as traders, as scribes, and many Ouagadouans convert to Islam during this period. Now, there is still some of the Dogon religion still today in Mauritania. It's maybe 3% of the population. But Dogon was the dominant religion in Mauritania before Islam replaced it. And Dogon is an animistic faith with beliefs about the spirits in various mountains, desert locations, flora and fauna. Eventually, Moroccan soldiers would come down, like the Almoravids, to try and conquer the territory. But those conquests, even though they took some of the border regions, like Adarost, never were successful in taking Kumbisale. And you can see there the Almoravids at their greatest extent into Ouagadougou. Now, of course, they also pressed into Spain. The Almoravids, led by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, fought a major battle at a place called Azalaqa in Arabic, which is common to Spanish as Sagrajas. And that battle at Sagrajas secured Almoravid control over most of southern Spain. The Almoravids were replaced by the Almohads due to internal revolts, and the Almohads unified an entire empire. Now, the Almohads, as we discussed, were very fanatical. I think it wouldn't be too far to say that they were the Taliban of their day. They had a very strong aqidah, or statement of belief, and they engaged in numerous massacres of both Jews and Christians, as well as other Muslims who did not follow their level of piety. In particular, and we know that, for example, they raised mosques because they were not, at least to the opinion of the Almohads, pointed properly at Mecca and reoriented by them by even fractions of a degree. But after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, which we remember from our discussions of the Crusades, as well as our discussion of Andalus, the Almohads were fighting a losing battle in the Spanish Peninsula. We then have the replacement of Ouagadougou with a new civilization called Mali. And within Mali, you have the creation of the wealthiest person in history, probably, who is Mansa Musa. Mansa being their title for ruler, so Musa is his actual name. And Mansa Musa decided to take a pilgrimage, a Hajj to Mecca. And when he made this Hajj, he gave out so much gold that the value of gold in Egypt deflated for 12 years. So we get to this point where the Almohads control most of northern Africa and southern Spain, but increasingly as we move towards 1300, the Almohads collapse due to internal strife, and their empire breaks really down into 4 constituent components. The Hafsids in Tunisia, which we've met. We met them when we were talking about the Eighth Crusade, and we met them when we were talking about the wars with the Ottoman Empire. with Tlemcen, which we met a little bit when we talked about Barbarossa, at Granada, which we talked about with Andalusia, and of course the Marinids. Now, the Marinids tried to recreate that situation that the Almohads, the Almoravids and Almohads did, where they invaded Spain and fought a key battle and were therefore able to hold on to the southern part of Spain. And that was the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340. At this battle, the Castilian government was able to effectively rout the Marinid soldiers and defeat them along with the Emirate of Granada. That said, they couldn't pursue the Emirate of Granada beyond the Sierra Nevada mountains, and so Granada survived, but the Marinids would never return to Spain. That would be the last time that Moroccans would try to affect cross-border conquest. That said, the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese would never come under Moroccan sovereignty again doesn't mean that the reverse was true. In fact, for most Spanish and Portuguese, the reconquest would include a taking of Moroccan territory and would bring Christianity back to Morocco. It wasn't simply to liberate the Iberian Peninsula. And we see this with the Portuguese as early as 1415. So this is nearly a century before the fall of Granada and the unification of Spain. Portugal sends its lead naval commander, Henry the Navigator, to take the city of Ceuta. Ceuta today is under Spanish rule, but you can see the flag of Ceuta, a version of the flag of Portugal, which is still the flag of Ceuta today because Ceuta was simply ceded to Spain in 1668. But with Henry the Navigator's taking of that city, there were numerous other embarkations that the Portuguese led all up and down the coast of Morocco, and you can see those on the left-hand side. Many of these cities have been renamed by either the Moroccans or were renamed by the Portuguese, and the Moroccans reverted to the original name. So some of these cities may be familiar to you if I use the common name that they're used by now. For example, the city of Anfa is the modern city of Casablanca. The city of Mogador is the modern city of Essaouira. The city of San João de Mamora is the city of Mehdia. And the Portuguese built these forts and were able to control the sea lanes moving across the coast of Morocco, but were unable to move beyond a small coastal veneer of control. In fact, with the exception of Brazil, in the 1400s and 1500s, the Portuguese Empire tended to be a naval empire as opposed to a land-based empire. Now, as I mentioned, we talked about Barbarossa and Algeria, and this was the Spanish interest in expanding into the African continent. You have in 1509 Spaniards arriving in Algiers, in the city of Oran, in the western part of Algeria, and conquering it from the local Zayanid dynasty. In fact, they besieged the al-Mashwar palace. Barbarossa besieged the al-Mashwar palace, as we talked about in episode 24. We also talked about how the Spanish attacked Tunisia at this same time, going after the Hafsid dynasty. And even though it took 1 million gold ducats to outfit the fleet that would sail to Tunisia, the reason that the Spanish had it is that they had confiscated gold from the Inca Empire in 1534. That gold had managed to make its way to Spain, and now they could use it to pay for all these ships and launch this invasion. That said, the Spanish were able to keep the Hafsids in power and eject the Ottoman attempts to include Tunisia into the Ottoman Empire, at least for a short time. We also talked about, but in less detail, the situation in Morocco with the Ouattassid dynasty. So in 1465, the Marinids have a number of serious difficulties and are unable to continue ruling. So a Berber dynasty called the Wattasids takes power, but they are unable to really deal with foreign threats. In the 1540s, the Wattasids have a number of different battles fighting the Portuguese. You can see there in the yellow. The Ottomans come over, led by Kara Hassan Pasha from Algeria. Kara Hassan Pasha is one of the descendants of Barbarossa. They fight against the Zionids of Tlemcen at certain points and require the help of the Spanish in order to secure their position. Now, this also happens that the Sa'adians reach out to the Spanish and are able to establish their dynasty. So we have this huge confluence of different things going on in Morocco, as the Wattasids are too weak to control power, and the Sa'adians under Moulay Muhammad aš-Šeikh begin to consolidate power around the city of Taroudant. You can see Taroudant is in the southern part of the modern country of Morocco, and from that point, Muhammad aš-Šeikh is willing to make alliances with European leaders, especially the British, and begins to buy cannons from them. So his most effective use of cannons is actually at Agadir, which is a seaside city controlled by the Portuguese. And he builds a fortress called the Agadir Ufla, overlooking the city. And in that fortress, he puts his new cannons and pummels the city throughout the year of 1541, leading to an astonishing victory, forcing the Portuguese out. And he does this in a number of places throughout southern Morocco, consolidating his hold before he moves further north and removes the Wattasids from power. As I pointed out, he removes the Wattasids from power by joining with the Spanish. The Wattasids had tried to retain their position by reaching out to the Ottomans. And so the Ottomans and Spanish effectively fought a proxy war with Morocco being that battleground. And the Sa'adians eventually come out on top, resulting in a new organized Moroccan dynasty in the Sa'adians. But the coastal cities are, in many cases, are still controlled by the Portuguese. And so you begin to have a situation where the Portuguese are trying to reassert their power. And in particular, in 1578, there's the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. In this battle, we have the Portuguese supporting one Moroccan claimant to the Sa'adian throne, Muhammad II, and we have Abd al-Malik I, the Moroccan Sultan, who is supported by the Ottoman forces, fighting them. This battle is incredibly destructive to all sides. Muhammad II dies, Sebastian I of Portugal dies, and Abd al-Malik I of Morocco also dies. So both claimants to the title of king for Morocco, as well as the Portuguese king, die. So sometimes it's called the Battle of Three Kings. And the Portuguese forces are thoroughly surrounded and defeated by the Moroccan forces. Now, what ends up happening on the Portuguese side is tremendous. The death of Sebastian I pretty much leaves the Portuguese kingdom without a successor. And so Philip II, who was third in line to the Portuguese throne, argues that he should be the king of Portugal. The Portuguese nobles try to resist this, and this leads to the Portuguese War of Succession in 1580 to 1583, following which Philip II ruled Portugal as part of his crown domains, including Spain, until Portuguese restoration in 1640. So this battle in Morocco fundamentally changed the European paradigm and put Portugal on the defensive in terms of its worldwide colonies, because Philip II cared much more about the Spanish Empire than he did about maintaining the Portuguese Empire. And so many of the Portuguese cities began to be attacked by the English and the Dutch. Abd al-Malik had given tribute to the Ottomans. That's why they had supported him during the war. And his son continued that tradition. That son, of course, is Ahmad al-Mansur. Ahmad al-Mansur is the most famous Sa'adian sultan, and he was responsible for really developing the Moroccan state in the Sa'adian dynasty. And his relations with England were rather deep and profound. In fact, this picture is actually the picture of his leading diplomat. We don't really have a good picture of him. And that diplomat is believed to have been the source of the character of Othello in the play Othello by Shakespeare. Moroccans were also heavily influential when it came to trade with England, because they were able to provide sugar and cotton in exchange for English weapons. There was also the issue that he wanted to remain independent from the Ottoman Empire. And one of the ways that he did this was to declare himself caliph. The Ottoman Empire at this time, led by Murad III, had already declared themselves the caliphate. They were in control of Mecca and Medina from the year 1517 onwards. And so the declaration by Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur that he was the caliph was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire's claim. This is especially acute because the Sa'adians are Sharifian, right? The Sa'adians are this Arab population, so they are actually legitimate inheritors of the claim that a caliph has to come from the tribe of Quraysh. The Sa'adians claimed they were from the tribe of Quraysh, and so therefore they could legitimately claim to be caliphs, whereas the Ottomans really had to rest on their power over the holy, their power as custodians of the holy mosques in order to claim that title. So Murad III gave permission to Uluj Ali Rais, who was the governor of Algeria, to invade Morocco if Morocco would not submit to being part of the Ottoman Empire. So Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur quickly turned around, paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire, changed the speeches so that they would recognize the Ottoman Empire as the caliph, and proceeded to give an annual gift to the Ottoman Empire in order to call off Uluj Ali Rais. However, once Uluj Ali Rais had died in 1578, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur felt secure enough to stop giving the tribute and to reverse his decisions on the khutbahs, on the speeches in the mosques, and reassert his title as caliph. From that point onward, the Ottoman Empire and the Moroccan state would be rivals, despite both being Muslim states, and often they would turn to Christian states as allies in their fight against one another. One of the largest provocations, at least from the Ottoman side, was that the Moroccans entertained an embassy from Spain. Remember, Spain had launched an invasion of Algeria in 1509 and maintained and had tried to frustrate the Ottoman Empire's attempts to acquire Tunisia in the 1530s. So the Moroccans' friendship towards the Spanish embassy was seen as a direct attack on the Ottoman Empire's hold in Northern Africa. Conversely, Ahmad al-Mansur was very angry about the Ottomans supporting the expansionist dreams of Uluj Ali Rais. So, but not only was he a trader and a military strategist, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur was also a massive builder. And this is Al-Badi' Palace in Marrakesh. Al-Badi' Palace was incredibly astonishing in its original day. I mean, this is how it looks now, and tourists can visit it in Marrakesh. The way it would have looked originally was much closer to the Alhambra in Spain, because it's built by the same types of architectural styles. And the cultivation of gardens within within an architectural space in the Islamic world is done primarily to illustrate the power over water and the power over growth. Because obviously in a desert, the ability to grow massive gardens is a luxury. Unfortunately, Moulay Ismail, who we might have the chance to talk about today, maybe we'll talk about him next week, stripped all of the edges of the exterior, which is why it looks like this today. But still, it is an impressive reminder of the power that Ahmad al-Mansur wielded. He also didn't start them, but he definitely expanded them. These are the Sa'adian tombs. These are the tombs of Ahmad al-Mansur, you can see in the center, and his forebears. All of the raised plinths refer to one of the Sa'adian monarchs. Now, one of the interesting things is that while Moulay Ismail was willing to rip apart the palace al-Badi because it was just a palace, he wouldn't dare disturb the dead. So we can actually still see the Sa'adian architecture, the frescoed walls, the columns, all of the original tile work that the Sa'adians made when they created the site. The one irony, of course, is that Moulay Ismail, in order to remove the Sa'adians from the historical record, literally built a wall around the entire complex. And it was only discovered later when airplanes flew over this area and discovered that there was this large patch of land that nobody could access. So we now have to talk a little bit about Songhai. We've talked about a number of African states. We talked about Ouagadougou. We've talked about Mali. The successor to those is Songhai. And the Songhai were led by military generals called the Askia. The Askia was their family name, but they sort of ran the country as a military empire. And they expanded it through the declarations of jihad against other tribes. Now, there were still many animists among the territories controlled by the Songhai, and there weren't forcible conversions, but the Songhai saw the Islamic religion as useful for organizing the empire, and it allowed the importation of scribes who could manage to settle all the documents within the empire. We know several things about how the Songhai Empire was run during the reign of Sidi Muhammad III, who was their most powerful leader. We know, for example, that they used cowrie shells as currency, and that they continued the trade of salts for gold, but they decided to cut out the middleman. You can see that the empire went all the way up to Taghaza in order to include the Taghaza salt mines. We also see that the amount of gold that they were able to bring into the empire was significantly less. Even though they controlled many of the gold mines near Jenne, they were not able to sell all the gold because Europeans had begun to build fortresses along the southern coast of West Africa and trade with other African peoples like the Akan for gold coming from the hinterland. So gold going to the Europeans was simply not going to the Songhai. That said, the Songhai built massive structures. You can see the tomb of Askia Muhammad III on the left-hand side in the city of Gao, which was his capital city. You can also see the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. Now, the University of Sankore already existed by the time the Songhai were in power, but they continued to patronize it and promote it as a school of Islamic learning. And also you have the construction of large mosques and imperial palaces throughout the empire. Now, this is a modern construction in Jenne, based on the way that the Songhai built their structures. We don't have many pictures of what Songhai cities would have looked like theoretically, but you can imagine buildings similar to the mosque in Jenne. There's a question as to why there are sticks protruding from the sides. That's actually the construction technique. Unlike a lot of areas of the world where there's significant amounts of timber, there wasn't enough timber to actually frame the mud. And so the easier technique was to just layer the sticks almost like rebarb and build the mud around them, and then it would harden and take that shape. So that's actually an intentional part of the structure. So now the now Ahmad Ahmad al-Mansur, Ahmad the victorious, the al-Mansur means the victorious. Ahmad al-Mansur was looking towards this gold trade, and he noticed that significant amounts of gold, as I pointed out, were going to Akan. Significant parts were also going to Fizan in what's modern day Libya, and with the cotton and sugar trade to England, they were able to acquire English arquebuses and English artillery in order to expand their power. They also wanted slaves. A significant portion of the Moroccan army was made of black slaves, similarly to how we discussed with the Egyptian military. And those slaves would be the footmen. Unlike in Egypt, there was no real Mamluk class in Morocco of Turkic mercenaries. There were Turkic mercenaries, but they were not a class. They were much closer to an individual elite that would train Arabs in riding horses. So you would have this unified military of black infantrymen and Arab horsemen that had been expertly trained by both European and Mamluk mercenaries. So, considering the lack of access to gold, Ahmad al-Mansur decided that the right course of action would be to invade the Songhai and recover the gold that way. Now, you have to realize that this is a conquest from one side of the Sahara all the way to the other side of the Sahara. It is a deeply grueling experience, and even though 4,000 cavalry were sent and 10,000 camels, a quarter of that perished en route to the destination. That said, when they finally encountered the forces of the Songhai, we end up with the Battle of Tondibi, which probably takes credit as one of the weirdest battles to have ever been fought in world history. And what basically happened is that coming from the north, coming from Taghaza, where the salt mines were, the Sa'adians were marching towards Gao, and they saw the assembly of the Songhai, which included 20,000 infantry, 15,000 on horseback, and over 1,000 cows. You're not misunderstanding me, cows. And so what the Songhai do is that they try to send the cows after the Moroccans stampeding and use the confusion that would result from those cows stampeding to then attack the Mongol line. The difference, of course, is that the Mongols had artillery. And so the Mongols fired their artillery at the cows. The cows got panicked and turned around, running at the Songhai lines, becoming much more of a liability than an asset. And then the artillery focused on the Sa'adian, the artillery focused on the Songhai cavalry and decimated them quite effectively. The Moroccans had been skilled in the use of drill, which is standing your ground, firing, and firing in waves, so that as one group is reloading, another group is firing. This was effective, very effective in destroying cavalry, and allowed the Sa'adians to reach the city of Gao and to reach the city of Timbuktu and Jenne, and to sack all three cities, bringing immense amounts of gold north to Morocco. But once it became obvious that a cavalry charge against artillery and arquebuses would be an absolute disaster from the side of the Songhai, resistance became much more effective. They were able to close the distance and use tactics other than direct charges in order to effectively keep the Moroccans at bay. As a result, the long-term Moroccan presence in the Niger Bend, right, that corner of the Niger River, where Jenne, Timbuktu, and Gao are, became increasingly difficult. You had successors to the Askia system, like Nuhu, leading a resistance against the Moroccans, and the Moroccans began to install their own rulers in the Niger Bend, and these people began to marry local Songhai populations, and these intermarriages between Moroccans and Songhai were called arma. The Arma are still an ethnic group that remained in power in this part of Morocco until the 19th century. And there are still Arma alive today. You can see, for example, this is Ali Farka Touré. He's a Malinese singer from the 1960s and 70s, and he is Arma. But what really became the death knell of Morocco holding this territory was just how much it cost to maintain it. All the gold that they kept recovering from the Niger Bend went, in many cases, to the purchase of weapons from England in order to keep the system going. The Moroccans were not producing their own military hardware. And additionally, the convoys across the Sahara were incredibly difficult in order to make and they couldn't be made routinely, which meant that in the Bend, you began to have the Arma becoming increasingly more and more independent, such that by the time that Ahmad al-Mansur died in 1603, they were basically running their own country called the Pashalik, the Pashalik of Timbuktu. Now, Ahmad al-Mansur died in 1603 because of a plague, and then Morocco was rocked from 1603 pretty much until the 1660s with poor rulers and chronic instability. You have some of the main power centers at this time were Marrakesh and Fez. And for example, after Ahmad al-Mansur died, one of his sons took power in Marrakesh. He was recognized as the legitimate sultan, and the other one took power at Fez. And the two of them would fight each other consistently. Now, I'm pointing out Saleh on this map because Saleh is a very interesting story that I think is worth a second to talk about. Now, the Republic of Saleh, which is across from Rabat, the modern-day capital of Morocco, along the Bouregreg River, was its own republic. And it was a republic formed by Moriscos. Those are Muslims who had lived in Spain. And because Spain had forcibly converted all Muslims to Christianity, they were originally Christians. When they moved to Morocco, they deconverted back to being Muslims. But these Moriscos were specifically from the town of Hornachos, which you can see on this map of Spain in the upper right-hand side. Now, once they had come to Rabat, they began to create their own pirate republic, where they had their own divan or legislature. And similar to Venice, the legislature was appointed by the powerful families, but it represented the interests of the locals, and there was no leading sultan. They also had their own group of pirates. At the very beginning, those pirates were led by Jan Jansun. Jan Jansun was a Dutch man. He had been married several times before. In 1600, he began sailing. At that point, he was captured by the Algerians. He converted to Islam, probably under pressure, but it seems that after his conversion, he was a true believer. He tried to evangelize a number of different people. And Jan Jansun gathered a group of pirates together. They had a number of warships between them, and they called themselves the Saleh Rovers. They would attack other merchant ships and bring them into Saleh, their riches, that is, and that's how they sustained the republic. Eventually, you had the immigration of other Andalusians and other Moriscos who were not from Hornachos, and there were some dynastic disputes resulting in the divan being divided half between Hornacheros, right? Those Andalusians from Hornachos, and the remaining Andalusians. The dominant language of the Republic of Saleh, because these were all Spanish Muslims, was Spanish. It had Arabic loan words, and most of them could speak Moroccan dialect of Arabic because they were conversing with people outside of the Republic. But generally speaking, the language was Spanish by these effective Muslim colonizers. We also have a number of developments to the fortresses along the Atlantic Ocean that would allow ships that were passing by to be within cannon range long before they could actually see the cannons. You can see, for example, this is the Udaya, or the fortress in Rabat. And you can see the Scala on the right-hand side. That's the tower where um, the cannons can be placed to shoot the ships. And on the top of the left-hand side, you have a semaphore platform where the Saadians who were controlling the fortress could signal the presence of a ship in order for the cannons to fire. This was all organized in a very pristine and exacting way because their method of making money was piracy. But the Saadians were increasingly weak and unable to control their dynasty, which led to all this civil strife, including the development of a rival dynasty, the Alaouites. Now, the Alaouites were originally based in that purple region, in the eastern and southern parts of Morocco. The Alaouites are also Sharifians, right? They're also descended from Arabian populations, and in particular, the Alaouites claim to be descended from Hassan ibn Ali, one of the grandsons of Muhammad, which of course gives them legitimacy if they were to declare a caliphate. And Moulay Rashid and his brother were effective in bringing together different coalitions of Moroccans to assist them in the various battles that they fought, starting in the eastern part of Morocco, right, going through the cities of Taza and Fez, then moving up to the northern part of Morocco, very close to Tangier, and then finally taking the city of Marrakesh. Moulay Rashid took the city of Marrakesh just before he died. Now, his allies included two. As I said, he was able to put together coalitions of both Arabs and Amazigh. So, for example, you have the Guiche. You can see the Guiche in the upper right-hand side. Those are Arab warring tribes. And the Guiche formed his backbone of his elite forces, but he also recruited from Berbers like the Bnei Snasen, who come from eastern Morocco today, and they are Zenata Berbers. You had his greatest opposition generally came from Masmuda tribes. For example, the Sufi orders in Dila were almost all Masmuda Berbers, and those were his chief rivals. The territory they control is on the map in the yellow area. Once Moulay Rashid had unified the majority of the Arab-controlled Moroccan state, he set the stage for his brother, Moulay Ismail, to take power. Now, Moulay Ismail was one of the longest reigning monarchs in Moroccan history. He ruled for 55 years. So he did an incredible amount of things during his reign. He's incredibly famous for many of the wrong reasons, but it's important to sort of go through his accomplishments for both good and ill. The first is that he was deeply distrustful of the Ottomans. The Ottomans paid numerous pretenders to the Moroccan throne in order to try and overthrow Moulay Ismail. And so Moulay Ismail not only had to defeat those pretenders and the rebellions that they caused, but he had difficult relations with Algeria, which was under Ottoman regency. He was also known for imposing significant amounts of corvée labor, especially on prisoners, in order to build the structures that we will see in a bit. Those amounts of man-hour and work were incredibly difficult, especially in his new capital of Meknes, which was a city that he built from practically nothing when he inherited power. And probably his single biggest contribution to Moroccan politics was the creation of the Abid al-Bukhari, or the slaves of Bukhari. And they're called that first because they're slaves. They're since Morocco controlled those areas in the Niger Bend, you had a steady supply of black slaves that were brought to Morocco. These slaves were loyal exclusively to Moulay Ismail and were organized into military units. In many ways, this capturing of slaves, transportation to another country, and isolation of them looks very similar to the Kurdi or to the Janissaries in the Safavid Empire or the Ottoman Empire, respectively, in that you're creating a group of troops loyal exclusively to Moulay Ismail. Now, it's not the case that those were the only troops. Remember, Moulay Rashid had managed to create coalitions of Guiche and Berbers, and those coalitions still remained under Moulay Ismail. It's just that the Abid al-Bukhari, those black slaves who were so pious that they kept books by Sunni theologian al-Bukhari on them, were his shock troops and his dominant forces in controlling the internal politics of Morocco and avoiding dissent. Now, he expanded in both the north and the south against numerous enemies. In terms of his southern conquests, he was able to take the cities of Shinqit, Brakna, Tararza, and Taghaza. Taghaza, again, being that city of the salt mines. And because of this, he was able to reconfirm Moroccan power there and make sure that the Pashalik of Timbuktu recognized him as the legitimate Moroccan leaders. This also underlies a lot of modern claims that Moroccans have toward the territory of Western Sahara, since Moulay Ismail integrated it into his country during this time. The conquests to the north are a lot more difficult to organize. Most of them were against the Portuguese. Most of them were against the Spanish that had come to inherit these parts of the Portuguese Empire, like Asila, like Larash, and like Mehdia. But the northernmost point, Tangier, was actually Portuguese until it was sold to the English in 1668 as a wedding present, as part of the dowry, sorry. And so the English led the defense of Tangier at the Battle of Jews Hill. The name is rather ironic, since when the British took power, they expelled all the Jews, fearing that those Jews might be loyal to the Moroccans more so than to the English. And despite several difficult battles that the Moroccans didn't necessarily prevail in, by 1666, Tangier had fallen back into the Moroccan space and the English had been ejected. Notwithstanding the English losses, the English loss of Tangier, relations between the Moroccans and the English remained cordial, both seeing the importance of their alliance against the Spanish and against the Ottomans. Now, one of the ways that Moulay Ismail generated revenue for all these conquests was the ransoming of hostages. So when he would conquer one of these cities, he would imprison the European soldiers and the European civilians he encountered there, and then ransom them back to Europe. And you can see the Mercedarians, who are a Catholic order, who would go to Morocco and pay the ransom to bring these Christians home to their mother countries. And that stream of wealth, constantly incoming, fueled more conquests and more wars against the Europeans. So it became a vicious cycle that promoted the removal of European coastal cities on the African continent. We mentioned that Moulay Ismail built up the imperial Kasbah of Meknes. Meknes being his new capital, it's relatively close to Fez. And you can see the incredible architecture of the Bab al-Mansur, the door of victory, which is the primary door into the Kasbah, or the military enclosure. Similar to what we saw with the Sa'adian tombs, we have a lot of Andalusian style of architecture, Mudekhar style. A lot of geometric tile work, as well as arches. This is the Qubbat al-Khayatin, or the Chamber of Traders. Now, the Chamber of Traders specifically refers to what's below this, physically speaking. But I wanted to show a picture So you can see also the tile work and the intense carving of the upper tiles before they were mounted. There were numerous rooms with this type of tile work in the Kasbah because this was the imperial palace of Moulay Ismail. The reason it's called the Chamber of Traitors is that below this was a massive prison complex in which many of the pretenders, the ones that the Ottomans had been supporting, were jailed, as well as those European prisoners pending their being ransomed by the Mercedarians. And so those areas were usually, yeah. And finally, we have the mausoleum. This is where Moulay Ismail is actually buried. You can see his burial tomb in the background, in that room below the second chandelier light. And you can also see the incredible tile work, the fountains, the eight-sided star, and the numerous cut-in style of architecture all around the archways. When it came to, oh, that's funny how that happened. When it came to Moulay Ismail's personal life, he had a harem of 500 women, and those women, and it is said of Moulay Ismail that he had to have sex every single day, sometimes multiple times per day, and it's unclear how many children he fathered. He certainly fathered the most children of any recorded person, of any recorded person. The smallest number I've seen is 888. The largest number I've seen is 1,100. So it really, leaves open the question: how many kids is too many kids? Apparently, for Moulay Ismail, you can never have too many. There were numerous punishments exacted on anybody aside from the individual eunuch assigned to each of the women in the harem who would look upon those women. Any servant, any petitioner, any minister who was seen to have looked at a member of his harem was immediately killed. The one exception, as I said, were the eunuchs. And in many cases, petitioners who went to see Moulay Ismail would bow their heads so that way they couldn't see the women and they couldn't be accused of having looked at them. We also have the development of foreign relations by Moulay Ismail. He tried to cultivate relations with France, in particular sending the ambassador Muhammad Tanim. You can see Muhammad Tanim in this Italian painting, where he's seeing a comedy, an Italian-style comedy. However, his flirtation with an alliance with France really broke down in 1718 because of the War of Spanish Succession. Now, the War of Spanish Succession put a Bourbon king, right, a relative of the French King Louis XIV. This is King Felipe V, on the throne of Spain, and that meant that France was now aligned with Spain, and Morocco couldn't have an alliance with any country that had favorable relations with Spain, at least very strongly positive ones. And so they then turned to pursuing better relations with the enemies of the Iberians, both the enemies of both the Spanish and the Portuguese, such as the English and the Dutch Republic. They had treaties with the Dutch Republic as early as 1610, but they reaffirmed their commitment in 1684 with the treaty you see here. We also see that the Republic of Saleh had been integrated into Moulay al-Rashid's Alaouite state, but the Corsairs had now become a part of that state. And so piracy had become part of the revenue generation process for Moulay Ismail. And you can see Corsairs fighting with Europeans in this picture. After Moulay Ismail died in 1727, there was a difficult readjustment as numerous of his sons contended for the throne. It took 30 years before Sidi Muhammad ibn Abdullah, also known as Muhammad III, became the leader, the Sultan of Morocco, and he tried to bring Morocco back into a state of normalcy. He did that by removing the Abid al-Bukhari. In many cases, during that 30-year interim period, the Abid al-Bukhari would choose which of Moulay Ismail's sons would be in power. And so you had shifting between Fez and Marrakesh. You had different alliances, and the Abid al-Bukhari basically were the power behind the scenes. So Sidi Muhammad managed to push them into menial locations and therefore remove them from the process of statecraft. He then set about building more of the country. Thus, he created the first major Moroccan port of Essaouira. It had previously been the Portuguese fort of Mogador, but he substantially expanded it, especially its shipping areas. Another Portuguese city that had fallen to him was the city of Afna. And Afna he didn't take by battle. The Portuguese had abandoned it because there had been an earthquake in Lisbon in I want to say 1750, but it's around there. And the earthquake in Lisbon had effects in Constantinople. In the city of Afna, resulting in the Portuguese really abandoning the city. Sidi Muhammad retook the city and began to build it up as the city that we now know as Casablanca. And he gave it the name in Arabic that it still carries to this day, which is Dar Bayda, or also White House, just like Casablanca in Spanish. He did lead wars against the Portuguese, though. He besieged the fortress at Masagan. And when he conquered that fortress in 1769, he relabeled the city as El Jadida, meaning the new one. But that was really his only major war. He generally tried to stay away from conflict if he could handle it, including when a French ship of the line started bombarding the Moroccan coast. He sued for peace very quickly and devolved to the French the pirates that they had been looking for. Probably most interesting to us is the war that are two other situations. Before that, he then moved the capital to Rabat, right where that Republic of Saleh had been. He built the first palace. Now, this is the royal palace in Rabat as it exists today, but he built it in 1785 at first, and that version has been since improved. As I said, there are two interesting situations that are worth talking about. The first one is his failed invasion of Melilla. So he besieged Melilla, which is a Spanish outcrop on the northern part of the African continent. And the siege was nearly 2 years long, with the English helping to form a blockade around the Spanish possessions. The Ottomans actually surprisingly coordinated with the Spanish. We remember that the Ottomans and the Habsburgs have a tenuous relationship, to say the least. But in this case, the Ottomans saw the Spanish defense of Melilla as diverting enough Moroccan troops that they could support the Algerians in pressing further inwards. In order to deal with the Algerians, Sidi Muhammad had to break off the siege and recognize that Melilla was a Spanish possession. However, he did get many of the territories outside of the city walls that had previously been controlled by Spain. All of this in the Treaty of Aranjuez of 1780. But as I said, the most interesting thing probably to the Americans here is that this is the moment where Morocco and the United States enter a treaty of friendship. In 1787, after much prodding on Sidi Muhammad's part, the Americans sign a treaty of friendship that is both written in Arabic and in English. You can see the signature of John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States, on the Treaty of Friendship. It is the first recognition of the United States by any foreign power, because this precedes the Treaty of Paris of except for the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and it is the oldest treaty of friendship that the United States has that is unbroken in its 234 years. One of the interesting things is that the Treaty of Friendship was to facilitate American-Moroccan relations in terms of commerce and trade. The Moroccans under Sidi Muhammad wanting to be more and more open to foreign trade and development, hopefully helping to modernize Morocco in the process. You can also see below George Washington's letter that he wrote to Sidi Muhammad in 1789 upon assuming the presidency. One of the interesting things is that since the American-Moroccan Friendship Treaty was passed in 1787, it was passed when the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which was the first constitution that that country had. The Articles of Confederation was a very different organizational system than was promulgated in 1789 under the US Constitution that is currently active. And so George Washington sent this letter at the end of 1789 to reassure the Moroccan leadership that the United States was still going to honor its commitments that it had made during the Articles of Confederation period, namely maintaining the friendship and amity between the United States and the Sultanate of Morocco, and that the United States would request any assistance that the Moroccans could give them in negotiating with the other Barbary states, negotiating with Algeria, Tunis, Tripoli, those states which had been harassing American shipping to a degree the Moroccans were not, and any assistance that could be given to that account. It's something that a lot of Americans forget, but in the early days of the United States, the country had significant debt, and up to 1/5 of the incoming taxes were sent to the Barbary states as tribute payments. So the resolution of that issue, which of course we're going to discuss in more detail next week, was a huge problem for was a huge concern for the United States, considering it was such a large part of the budget. By comparison today, military and defense spending is less than half of that percentage of the US budget today. All right, questions, comments, concerns? Next week, we are going to do the 19th century in the Maghreb region. So that includes Morocco, sort of following up on this lecture, everything that happened after Sidi Muhammad, as well as what happened in Algeria and Tunisia. We will then be taking a break of 3 weeks and reconvening in May to discuss the Persians. We also have our European Union series, which will be on the 20th of April, I believe, whatever that Sunday is, where we'll cover more issues related to European Union security. We have our Roman series, and Mark, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I did have to step away for a while, so maybe forgive me if this topic was already covered, but I remember reading some time ago that the Ottomans, I think in the 19th century, or maybe even earlier, got on the idea of factories. They saw that the Europeans were inventing factories, and that the Pasha said, "Go make factories," and they didn't know what to do so much. Does that ring a bell with you?
I mean, we talked about the industrialization in the Ottoman Empire during the Tanzimat period. In many cases, what ended up happening is you had European advisors who assisted with the creation of modern factories and developments, especially with the minority communities. The Greeks were known for, the Greeks and Armenians especially, were known for munitions manufacture. In Egypt, you had a much more thorough modernization, right? We talked about in the 19th century than anything we saw in the Ottoman Empire in terms of its speed and its organization. The problem, of course, is that the Egyptians lost power because of the massive debts that they took out from the great powers. And we covered that about 2 weeks ago. But in Morocco, the period that we're covering is in this up to the 1700s. So the industrialization that hit Europe hasn't even hit Europe yet. Europe is more advanced than Morocco, certainly, in terms of the creation of weapons and munitions. But Morocco is relatively on par with Europe in terms of city organization, sanitation, medicine, these kinds of developments. The real break occurs in the 19th century.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I have a question. Can you explain what's going on with Western Sahara? Why is it still a disputed territory, and between whom? Okay. This plays a lot more into what happened in Morocco in the 20th century. So in 1912, for a variety of reasons, the French and the Spanish partitioned the territory of Morocco into two distinct occupation zones, a zone given to Spain and a zone given to France. The French zone was contiguous, the Spanish zone was not. So the Spanish controlled the northern area of Morocco. Actually, if I go back a few slides, so I have a map of all of Africa, it'll be a little clearer. Okay, here we are. So the Spanish zone, this northern area here, and this southern area here, and some small cuts along the coast, like this is Sidi Ifni. And the French zone is everything else that you see. Actually, the Spanish zone extends all the way to the border, I think. So that. So you have these two divided occupation zones. And the Spanish further subdivided their zone along this parallel here. And they called this colony, which roughly is the territory of Western Sahara, they call it Rio de Oro, or River of Gold, despite there not being any gold there. And so Rio de Oro was given a different colonial administration from the rest of Spanish Morocco. Fast forward to 1956. Muhammad V, Sultan of the Alaouite Dynasty, who was still in power, the French decided it was easier to rule Morocco as a protectorate than as a direct territory. And so they left the Alaouite power structure intact. They just required them to take orders from the French Governor General. So Muhammad V negotiated the independence of Morocco in 1956. The French were more concerned with what was going on in Algeria. And so they were willing to give the Moroccans independence in exchange for the Moroccans remaining neutral on the Algeria question. So that French area became independent, and it became a negotiation with Spain for the Spanish territories to become part of Morocco. Some of those territories, like most of that northern region, with the exception of Ceuta and Melilla, most of that southern region, except for Sidi Ifni, became part of Morocco pretty much immediately. Those small enclaves did not, and Rio de Oro did not. And so in the mid-1970s, there became an increasing international push for Spain to relinquish its territories in Africa to the Moroccans, especially Sidi Ifni. And there was even a war in 1974 for the retaking of Sidi Ifni. Following this, the Moroccans had a large group of soldiers, and the push was now for Rio de Oro to be made independent in 1975. So this is the international community pressuring the Spanish to end its colonial occupation, not an indigenous revolt of Sahrawi, the people of Sahara, right? Not an indigenous Sahrawi revolt to remove them. So there's no government to whom the Spanish would devolve the independent state. So because there is no movement there, Morocco and Mauritania make an agreement that they will divide Rio de Oro between them. The Moroccans will take the northern 2/3 and basically until about here, and the Mauritanians will take the southern 2/3, basically until about there. And then Algeria basically says, if you do that, we will invade you, because the Algerians preferred a new independent Sahrawi state. That way they could have access to the Atlantic Ocean. And there's also the possibility that there might be more oil in Western Sahara. None has ever been found, but there's always the possibility of oil because Algeria has a lot of natural gas reserves. There's a possibility that some of that might extend. So because of Algeria's threats, Mauritania relinquished its 1/3 and said, we're not going to get involved. We wash our hands of this. The Moroccans in 1975 decided that they would then take the entire region, and they marched from the north all the way to the south in what is called the Green March. And so from 1975 onwards, Morocco controlled the entirety of Western Sahara. That said, the people of Western Sahara speak a different dialect of Arabic from Moroccans. While it's true that the dialects of Arabic differ from town to town and city to city, within Morocco, the Moroccan dialects of Arabic are different from the Hassani dialects of Arabic, which predominate in Sahara. And the Sahrawi, because they had been under Spanish occupation, their dominant European language was Spanish, not French, as opposed to the Moroccans, where in most places, even the areas of Spanish colonization, the dominant European language has switched to French. So we have this situation where now Morocco is in control of a population that is increasingly restive against the Moroccan control. And so a rebellion called the Polisario develops. This Polisario battle results in a ceasefire in 1991. And that ceasefire gives almost all of Western Sahara to the Moroccans effectively, because the ceasefire is pending a treaty. And so basically the Moroccan area of control looks like this. Anything on this side of the border is Moroccan. Anything on this side of the border is Sahrawi, controlled by the Polisario. The position of the Organization of African Unity, which is sort of like the United Nations of Africa, argues that Western Sahara should be an independent state, ruled by the Polisario. That is the general international view. The United States under Donald Trump has acceded to the Moroccan view, which is that Western Sahara was a part of Morocco, unlawfully split from Morocco during the 1912, and therefore now lawfully reintegrated to Morocco as as 3 Moroccan provinces. And Donald Trump is believed to have made this concession to the Moroccans in order to secure their assent to the Abraham Accords, which created peace between Morocco and Israel. So does that, Cassidy, does that explain the debate? Generally speaking, the most prominent advocate of the Polisario is modern day Spain. Right? They see this as the fruition of their colony trying to achieve independence. And so this has, and that in addition to those 2 Spanish cities that are still on the Moroccan coast, Ceuta, originally Portuguese, right, but given to the Spanish in the 1660s, and Melilla, which had been Spanish since 1497, that combined with the Sahara situation inflames Moroccan-Spanish relations. And so it's a little bit difficult for those countries to negotiate on those issues. All right. If there's nothing further, I think we should call it a night. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'll see you next week then.